I am Chef Germán Navarrete, Corporate Chef of the U.S. Meat Export Federation, and on its behalf, I welcome you to this webinar titled Meat to Go. I'll leave you now with Liz Wunderlich, who will kindly introduce our speaker today, Tim Murray. Enjoy the webinar, and I hope that all the information we share with you today proves of value and help in this new environment. Liz?
It is my honor to introduce Chef Timothy Murray, who as team leader of RDS Foods focuses on customizing center-of-the-plate proteins for national and international accounts like Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, Carl's Jr., Hardee's, Red Robin, Dunkin' Brands, and Chili's. Perhaps some of you back in the 90s might have attended his Serve Safe food safety seminars or taken one of his chef or apprentice exams. All of these were part of the educational programs from the National Restaurant Association and the American Culinary Federation. Chef Tim is a true culinologist. What is culinology? Culinology is the discipline of delivering a culinary food experience aided by science. Basically, it's the science behind the sizzle. We've asked Chef Tim to share that science of protecting our high-quality American beef, pork, and lamb in this new to-go environment we are embracing as a result of the COVID-19 situations in our markets. Take it away, Tim.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome to my kitchen. What we're here to take a look at is something that your guests can get after a to-go order is placed. Would you ever want this? Soggy fries, the overcooked vegetables, and of course, the protein overcooked. That's what's going to happen in the 13 to 27 minutes between your kitchen and your guest's hotel room, condo, or home. Today, we will be discussing how to deliver the best overall experience to your guest when it comes to the protein. The protein represents the primary food cost on your plate, and to your customer, it represents the primary perceived value of the food experience. In other words, you may get grace from your customer if the fries are low, but if that beef, pork, or lamb is overcooked and tastes terrible, you've got a problem. With today's new normal of takeout and delivery, your normal 2 to 4 minutes from the kitchen to the guest is now expanded to 13 to 27 minutes. How do you cook an a la minute steak, then have it hold in a to-go container for 13 to 27 minutes, and still come out with a quality steak? Well, really, we've got to use a little bit of science and look at the variables that we can control. We can control the cut, we can control the preparation, the cooking method, and we can control packaging. Along the way, we're going to use some science principles. One of those is thermalization. The basic principle of thermalization says energy, cold or hot, will equilibrate within a certain area. Many factors play into this concept. The strength of energy, so that comes from our ovens, whether it's a convection oven, a char broiler, or what have you. The density of that protein, how thick it is, the temperature of the object, and the containment structure, our actual packaging. And remember, in the presentation starting out, I used the styrofoam packaging, which many of you know the steak will lose its thermalization. Take a look at this PowerPoint. What you'll see is at the center, the little dots represent the protein. The green big arrows coming in represent the heat radiating into the protein. And the blue and red arrows represent the energy radiating off of the protein, bouncing off of the protein. With the protein in consistent and constant action to have the same temperature outside as inside, more green arrows will be absorbed until the temperature is reached. As we go through this presentation, keep that in mind. Over a 13 to 27 minute lag time between the kitchen and the guest, that protein will change its temperature and its doneness due to the variables. The variables, again, that we can control: cut selection, preparation, and the type of packaging. So let's start with the meat selection or the cut selection. What I have here is our different portion steaks. Steaks have something in them that helps maintain that beautiful red bloom that you see throughout the steak. That something is a protein called myoglobin. And myoglobin is responsible for holding the oxygen into the muscle. In the end, it causes the bloom of red or pink that we see in meat when it becomes red rather than gray after cooking. The more myoglobin, the more forgiveness of color. The steak will maintain a red bloom longer and at a higher temperature with the more myoglobin present. This is an 8-ounce filet beef tenderloin. It's about 1.5 inches to 2 inches thick, and it's prized for its tenderness as it's one of the least worked muscles on an animal. It also has a high level of myoglobin. At 1.5 inches, that is a concern. The thicker the cut, the better it will survive that 13 to 27 minute time. The flat iron, on the other hand, also an 8-ounce cut, you can see is noticeably thinner, 1/2 inch to 3/4 of an inch thick. But it's second in tenderness to the filet. It comes from the chuck area, the part of the animal that is overworked, and thus that muscle needs a lot of help breaking down the proteins and using a slow wet method of cooking like braising. The flat iron has a cousin called the Teres Major, and the Teres Major is 5th in tenderness. Your flat iron is actually 2nd in tenderness. Both of these are more tender than the New York strip or the ribeye. Remember, the high rate of myoglobin in this Teres Major, and it's a great steak flavor, and has lots of marbling in the Teres Major, I should say. The flat iron has lots of marbling. The Teres Major actually eats on the leaner side. For the Teres Major, the pros, of course, I just mentioned: high myoglobin, tender, and it really presents itself similar to a tenderloin. The cons are, if this piece of meat's overcooked, it could really just start to taste like pot roast, because that's actually where it comes from. It comes from the chuck area. Take a look at the strip loin. The strip loin is 8 ounces again, but really, look at that thickness. It's about 1/2 inch. I noticed that immediately, that this is the thinnest of the group, and I suspect will be a candidate for overcooking at 13 to 27 minute lag time. On the other hand is the top sirloin, or butt steak. It is as well 8 ounces, but you could see, because of its diameter being smaller, it's thicker. It's 2 to 3 inches. It tends to eat leaner than the filet or the flat iron, but still has great steak flavor. The myoglobin is not as much as in the tenderloin, but higher than in the ball tip. We'll talk about that next. This steak is ball tip steak. It comes from the bottom sirloin. That is about 1/2 inch right there thickness. And again, being very thin and having the lowest amount of myoglobin in it, what do you think will happen to the steak? Well, it failed so miserably during the 13 to 27 minute lag time that I actually used it as my example of a overcooked steak in the beginning of the presentation. Let's switch to the pork chop. Here you will see that the pork chop is about 0.75, 3/4 of an inch thick. It's 10 ounces, not 8. Really, that bone carries some of your weight there. Great surface area, but because it's thin, it has the potential to be overcooked. And then it'll be dry. If you cook it less, you have the potential for that guest to complain about the pink around the bone. Unlike beef, pork is not dependent on myoglobin amounts for palatability. One thing that you could do for this steak is keep it as a loin before you portion it. Cook that loin like you would a prime rib, chill it, then steak it. At service time, you're marking it, getting it up to temperature and to the guest. The benefit to that is that loin being roast all in one will hold in the moisture better, and you'll have more control over the doneness of that pork chop. You know, going back to the con of pink, some guests translate that to not being safe. But U.S. pork is safe at pink because we've eliminated the parasite that everyone wants to cook pork, that made everyone want to cook pork to well done, trichina. So the USDA's recommendation for an endpoint now is 145 degrees Fahrenheit. Our last cut is really the lamb rack. The pros of this is in a to-go situation, as a roast, this is great because it's not staked out. It's thick, has a bone to protect it, and it'll allow for a lot of forgiveness from the purging of natural juices. One con of this is this lamb fat here, once it reaches about 90 degrees or below, it starts to solidify and really have kind of a negative experience to your guest. Also, if you get the smaller eyes, for which this eye is pretty good, that could be suspect to overcooking. We've learned a few important things in this area. Thickness matters. The thicker it is, the better the thermalization to get you to that desired doneness and stay at that desired doneness. Second, myoglobin. It helps the steak maintain its nice rosy red color and maintain doneness. So let's look at how to prepare our proteins. Beef, pork, and lamb, all prepared in a dry heat method. Today we're focused on 3 different methods. The tried and true method, which is your char grill or char broiler. The banquet method, which some people may be familiar with, I'll go over that. And finally the sous vide method, which is a newer method, and I'll go over that in a little bit more detail. For the char grill, the pork chop, and the broil, the lamb chop, remember, they're basically the same heat when it comes to the heat source. One is from above, one is from below. The thermalization happens at the same time and is similar. One side is applied the heat, the other side is resting. This allows for more variance, unevenness of cooking. Keep that in mind, and let's see if that proves out later. The banquet method, as this slide will show from ultrasound, is a combination of the char grill and the roasting method. The steak is marked and chilled and held at a refrigerated state of 40 degrees Fahrenheit. When an order is placed, the steak immediately goes into the convection oven at 450 degrees Fahrenheit until it reaches 130 degrees internal temperature Fahrenheit. That will take approximately 8 to 10 minutes for a lamb chop. Under the Altersham and the Rationale, that slide I want to really just show you two different pieces of equipment that use a combination of dry heat and wet heat to thermalize the protein and maintain that temperature. There are many more brands out there for you to choose. In general, these ovens are called combi ovens. The third and final method is sous vide. Sous vide has a literal translation as it to be under vacuum. The French perfected this method in cooking. And basically, what it does is allows a protein to be cooked consistently throughout and not reach any higher temperature than the set point that you choose. So let's take a look at sous vide in its action. Basically, remember we said under vacuum. So this is a vacuum machine. It sucks the oxygen out of this bag and then heat seals it. So we'll go ahead and let that go. And as you can see, the bag crinkles from the oxygen being taken out of it. If you don't have this type of machine, another way that you could do this is really just using the property of water. Pounds per square inch of that water. The more you, the deeper you dive down with just a Ziploc bag, the air starts to come out of that bag. And right before the seal gets to the water line, you seal it, and you basically have a vacuum package. Now, once you have that, you could be consistent in your cooking method by going to a water bath. Sure, this can drop in. And this. And due to this element right here by Nova, you could cook at a consistent rate. You'll see right now, the set temperature is at 130.5. I just moved it. It was at 131, so now it's at 131. My water bath is 130.7 degrees Fahrenheit. And that's only because I put something cold in it. I put those steaks in it. I'm going to turn the machine off so I can show you the inside of this. Really interesting. You have your heat source, your coil. You have a fan that keeps the water moving. And then you have a couple of probes here for your temperature sets. Sous vide has become popular over the past 5 to 10 years because it has the ability to cook to a set point, cook to 130 degrees and no longer. Through the charbroiler and the convection oven and other equipment that we use a greater amount of energy going towards it. Imagine a 350 degree Fahrenheit oven to get your steak to 130 degrees, as opposed to the sous vide machine that's water is at 130. Now there's a couple other things that you have to remember with this. Thickness matters. So for me, a 2-inch steak at 130 degrees, within an hour it's cooked to that temperature, and it could be in that water bath for another hour to 2 hours without any degradation in any of its characteristics, taste, the tenderness of the product, or even the bite. So we finished with our steak selections. We've talked about our cooking methods. Now let's talk about packaging. There's many different packaging out there. Some of you may be stuck with what you have that's already been purchased or what's available to you in your country. There's no clear answer to the question on packaging. What works best for you? You've got to try it and you've got to use a little bit of trial and error in looking at what your packaging is. In the beginning of the presentation, I used a styrofoam container. And really, that's your low-end model. Styrofoam is not really a good thermalization insulation device. It's flimsy, and really the style is outdated. On this next tray, we're going to take a look at this huge. Imagine your steak in there and the heat energy that will be released by just that steak being there. Over time, a steak for here in this big huge container, and knowing our principle of thermalization, the steak will get cold. The heat will try to heat up the air in this area. So really, a large container like that for just a steak is not really the best idea. Let's take a look at this black container, and it's much smaller. And of course, that same steak has less physical area to exchange heat with. So in that 13 to 27 minutes, it has a chance to survive. Next packaging uses recycled products and cardboard construction. I like this packaging for its marketing ability. However, it has no advantage for your cup. The reason why is there's no thermalization insulation in this product. If you've got only this, take your steak, wrap it in butcher paper, sandwich paper, anything that doesn't have a wax finish to it, wrap that up, give it a nice tie, and put that in there, and that allows your steak to have some type of thermalization, but will not steam because the package is folded and any high heat is allowed to be released. Also, take the time just to write a note to your customer. In this new world we're going through, reach out to your customer in a personal way. I kind of wrote it, kind of said something like this: from my kitchen to you, wherever you decide to dine. Please enjoy this dish, especially prepared for you. I found that cooking the sides separately from the protein works best. 2 to 3 minutes, 50% power in a microwave to reheat your sides. For your protein, please use the au jus included. Simply heat that au jus up. And if your steak is too cold for your liking, dip the steak into the au jus. Just a quick dip. That'll warm up your steak or your chop for your enjoyment. Another tip is to place a small potato or other starch on that to-go container, and then place the steak on there. What happens in this situation is thermalization takes place between the steak and the potato. Also, typically with these containers, you get a puddle at the bottom. And no one really likes that puddle, but guess what? There's a lot of flavor there. So that potato will help absorb that purge, the little au jus that presents itself during that 13 to 27 minute lag time. Let me get rid of this for you. So we talked about the meat selection. We've talked about preparation. We've talked about packaging. So now let's bring it all together and see how thermalization works with all the variables of the cut selection the preparation and the choices, the choice of packaging, excuse me. We cooked each protein using three basic cooking methods: the charbroil, the banquet method, and the sous vide method. I used the following parameters. The charbroil method, it was ordered, when the order was placed, the product was cooked on a charbroiler to 130 degrees and then packaged. The banquet method, again, protein was marked earlier in the morning, chilled. When an order is placed, the steak is then fired in a convection oven, 450 degrees Fahrenheit till 130 degrees, then placed into the packaging. And on the sous vide, what I did with the sous vide is I marked the protein, so char marked it, packed it under vacuum as we did right over here, and I showed you, and placed it in a water bath. For the beef and the lamb, I cooked it at 130 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 hours. For the pork, I cooked it at 140 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 to 2 hours. And we know with the pork end set point of 145, that will come up to 145. All the steaks were held in a to-go package, approximately 25 minutes. Here comes the results. The individual platters being brought out right now represent the different cuts of steak. I have the filet. The first steak is the Terrace Major. We'll take a look at the Terrace Major first. It's the 5th most tender cut on the animal. Right here is the char, so we'll take a look at that. And look at that beautiful rose color. The myoglobin really held up there. And if you notice, I even used the smaller of the two to represent that. Let's look at the banquet method. Again, something new for you to take a look at. Similar, actually even a little bit drier, if I would, in my opinion. And then the sous vide method. Excuse me. Now the sous vide method, you can notice that right here you got about 1/8 of an inch of gray in the protein. You can see in the sous vide method, it's basically all the way around pink. So for the Terrace Major, all three of these held up for 22 minutes to 27 minutes after being cooked, whether it be in the charbroil method, the banquet method, or the sous vide method. Take a look at the filet, and you can see the size, the thickness matters here. The filet from the charbroiler, that should hold up pretty well because it was thick. From the banquet area, we're in that medium area. Still a little red because of that myoglobin in the filet, but definitely has seen a better time. If that was in the dining room, it would have been spot on. Waiting that 27 minutes in the container didn't help it. And then your sous vide method, which still is in that medium area. Nothing better than that coming out of the charbroiler because it's so thick. And your sous vide portion was thinner. Take a look at the top sirloin. These, remember, when we went through this before and we looked at the steak selection, these were the thicker of the group. Or the thickest of the group. Nice blooming color there. Oh, I'm sorry. For the confusion, folks. Right here is the char, banquet, and sous vide. So I cut the sous vide portion first. Still acceptable at a medium rare steak. A little bit on the drier side from the banquet method. great looking steak from the sous vide method. Let's take a look at the strip one. And you notice how thin that is. And again, my hypothesis is that the thicker the steak, the better it's going to hold up. That one actually is very rare. I've got to say maybe I've got an error in that one. That's what I was expecting right there. That's medium well, and that's the banquet method. And finally, on the sous vide method, it's an acceptable steak. Held for 27 minutes. But the strip loin, because it's so thin, can very quickly lead to an overcooked steak. Let's take a look at the pork chop next, and then we'll leave the rack of lamb. Charcoal? Okay. Had to ask my assistant there for a second about the direction here. Here's the char grill method for your pork chop. Definitely cooked all the way through. See how we did at that bone area? A little bit of pink in that bone area, but definitely acceptable. Banquet method, I would think you could see a little juiciness in that, and that held up a little bit better. And then our sous vide method. And you can see a little pinking around the thicker part of the chop right there. And I suspect if I cut into this, you'll see a little bit of pinking as well. Not as much. But definitely, you could see this glistening. And that's the moisture that's in the pork that sometimes that sous vide machine really helps and gives you that forgiveness of. Finally, let's take a look at the rack of lamb. There we go. We'll get it right. So char method. Medium. Not bad. The banquet method. Again, that's pretty good. That's on a medium to medium rare side, but again, I was very surprised that lasted. And then the sous vide method. So the sous vide method, you've got a rare. And again, that was cooked the sous vide way for approximately an hour and 45 minutes. So on this, I would go a little bit longer on the sous vide. Right here and right here, your adjustments are just fine. So remember, thickness matters. It helps with your thermalization. We've learned that there are some other options for cooking besides just cooking it last. And that is the sous vide method or the banquet method. And finally, we learned that packaging does matter for thermalization. And adding just a personal note, especially in this new normal, is a great option. From a rack of lamb, to pork chop. And then a juicy steak. The most successful cuts, the most success you will have is looking at the cuts combined with the preparation techniques and the packaging. Putting those three together will guarantee a positive guest experience in this new normal of to-go. We now turn to Human for any questions. Thank you.
I have some questions here from the audience. The first one is, could you please repeat the temperature of the water in the sous vide method? That is to say, how hot was the water in the container?
100. Yes, Herman. The water temperature for the beef was 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and that temperature was set and maintained for about an hour and a half. Those steaks were in there. I've tested steaks that go up to 2.5 hours in that water temperature, but just for today's presentation, we didn't go that far. On the other hand, for pork, I set the water bath at 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and that dwelled in the water the same amount of time, the hour and a half. And as you see with the pork, it came out juicy. On the other hand, the lamb was at 130 degrees Fahrenheit water temperature, and that too cooked for about an hour and a half or so. And the results of that is that we need to cook it a little bit longer.
Somebody's interested to hear a little bit more about the potato that you put on the bottom of the steak. They're asking if it's cooked or not cooked, or what do you recommend?
Sure. That potato was just par cooked. You could steam it. I par fried it. And definitely it's one of those things that's an accompaniment and is on the line. So really the food cost for something like that is minimal. And what it does is it helps in the thermalization of the steak, and the guest actually gets a good experience of enjoying that steak flavor from those juices.
Another question is regarding the temperature for each one of the cuts that you used in sous vide. I know you talked about the water temperature. Could you please talk about the internal temperature of the cuts that you cooked in sous vide?
Sure. Our target temperature on each one of the cuts for the beef was 130 degrees. For the pork, it was 140 to 145 degrees. When I took it out of the oven at 140 degrees, it raised to that 145 degree temperature. And on the pork, we looked at 135 degrees. I mean, on the lamb, excuse me.
Another question has to do with if how far from the desired cooking doneness that the customer wants should we leave the cut? Let's say 1 below or 2 below, in terms of the order comes in as medium, should we leave it rare, medium rare?
So yes, I understand what you're asking for. So that's why I did the char method on this, so that you could see this at 130 degrees and dwelling for, let's just say, that 25-minute period. The steak maintained its quality in some of them. Some of them it didn't, like the strip steak. But the set temperature overall for the internal temperature was at 130 degrees Fahrenheit.
Now, they're asking about aluminum containers. Well, how about aluminum? Can you please tell us a little bit about it?
Good question. My experience with aluminum in general is that it starts to steam that protein, whether it's beef, pork, or lamb, it steams the protein. I do have some packages right here that are aluminum on one side, plastic on the other, and they tend to be okay because you could leave half of it unsealed and steam could release. What I don't like about that foil situation is that it does seal that steak up and tends to steam it, and your flavor and your quality of doneness is affected.
There's another question. In terms of when you're cooking the rack whole, you recommend that better than that cutting into pieces? Uh, I know you mentioned this, but they're asking about this. Is it what's the best way to in terms of the pork, loin that you mentioned, or the lamb rack? Is it the best to go? I mean, cook the whole thing?
Sure. Yes, it is best to cook the whole rack because the thermalization stays insulated with the bone. So your bone helps that insulation right there in maintaining the doneness of the product. What I found is when I did cut them into chops, they overcooked and they were really kind of like steamed out after 27 minutes. So I did try to do those, and I changed that for this presentation this morning to a roast method to help with that, keep that thermalization inside the protein until the customer wants it. And again, in this new day and age, I think that your customer would like the fact that you've helped them with that and would go through the extra energy to cut it into a chop.
They're asking about the time when it comes into a very thick cut with bone. They're giving examples such as a tomahawk. Will probably weigh about 12 ounces or probably more. No, more than that.
More
20
than that.
ounces. 20 ounces. Sorry, I'm just thinking in grams. So, how long do you think it would take in the sous vide method?
So the sous vide method is a combination of the water bath temperature, the density of the product, and the length of it being in the water bath. I've done some work on it. I don't have that at my fingertips, but I definitely can make it available to the group for the thermalization and how to cook something that's more than 2 inches in a sous vide.
Now they're asking something else regarding how about hamburgers and meatballs? How do they work in this environment? This near to go. That is to say, what would be the best approach, for hamburgers and mainly minced meat, I think.
So hamburgers and meatballs, usually on your meatballs, you do have some forgiveness with a sauce that's accompanying that meatball. With the hamburgers, really, there has to be some studies done on that and some work done on that. I still go back to the method of the char grill for a hamburger, not necessarily the sous vide method, because unless you really perfect that, you could get some off flavors from the sous vide method on a ground product.
We're asking if there is a packaging available that you know of that avoids when steam coming out, because sometimes the steam doesn't help. It steams out. If you're cooking something that has just been grilled, you put it into the package, and then you close it, and then it's steam releases, so it doesn't help. They're asking if there is some kind of packaging that helps a little bit better. This is steam that obviously is released in this product. I mean, the product releases.
Sure. So here's your package right here. And I used that as a representative before in the presentation, but what I didn't highlight is this package does have a cutout to allow steam to vent out and prevent your overcooking of your protein. The other method is that you use something that's really just designed to naturally release steam. And all you're doing with this wrap is just kind of giving it a minor amount of thermalization. And again, the concept here is not to overcook that steak.
Yeah, could you go a little bit more in detail as far as the banquet method is? Because some of the people are not very familiar with the banquet method. Could you please delve a little bit more into it? Let's explain a little bit more what the banquet method is about, how it works, what you have to do.
Sure. If you've ever been to, I call it a banquet method because that's what I was told it was when I was an apprentice at 17. But basically, if you've ever gone to an event where you're served steaks for 100, 200 people. You ever wonder how they get those steaks done? And the way that they do is that they charbroil the steak first. So they mark it, get the marks on the steak. Then they chill down the steak on a sheet pan or another covering. And then when it's time for that banquet, or you get an order in your a la carte restaurant, you place it in a 450 degree convection oven. And that convection, again, going back to our thermalization concept, that convection is forcing heat into that cold steak. So it heats up fast and even for your steak. That's the banquet method. It comes out of the oven at basically the same endpoint as a charbroiler. 130 degrees was our target.
There's a very interesting question here, and I believe we all have these kind of questions right now because it's our rules different. Can you please tell us a little bit about whether you should be wearing a mask, face mask while cooking, or just at the time that you give this to the delivery man? I don't know, it's a bit, well, I guess we're all wondering, is it necessary to be wearing a mask all the time, or just at the time you give the food to the delivery man?
You're asking me a science question out of my discipline. And the regulations in the restaurant right now here in the States, and every country's different, is that you should be wearing a mask. If you're an employee in a restaurant, you should be wearing a mask whenever you possibly can. And then there's mandatory masks, such as when you're dealing with cold food, salads, things like that. It's mandatory. But working on a hot line on a Friday night or a Saturday night and having a mask on is actually a fire hazard. So the cooks on the line may or may not have masks on, but from the food going out to the line, the expediter and then the server, those people definitely have masks on all the time. I hope that answers your question. Not really my discipline.
Now they're asking another question regarding what is the maximum amount of time the cut will hold without losing any quality? Or that's to say, how long can you keep once cooked and packed? How long can you take it? What would you say is the maximum amount of time?
And Harman, are you speaking of the sous vide method?
In any of the methods, yeah, they're asking me basically, how long, what is the limit? Let's say 30 minutes, 40 minutes in general,
So
how long can you go in terms of pushing, this finished product?
That's really a hard question to answer simply. With the sous vide method, we know that the steaks can stay in the sous vide water bath for 2 hours without any degradation of quality. Whether you judge that quality, taste, on the texture of that steak. The other methods, they're dry heat methods. So the more you cook them, the drier they're going to get. And there's definitely an end point for some customers when it reaches a medium and they don't want the steak at all. And then there's others that will allow it to go further. But really, to answer your question, sous vide has some principles to it that help you, and I could provide something for the group in that regards. But in terms of the endpoint for the banquet method or a charbroiler, it really just gets overcooked and dried out.
And going back to sous vide, they're asking, once you have this meat to the temperature that you mentioned, at different temperatures, what do you do with it? How do you reheat it before it goes out for service, or on the to go?
So there's a couple of different concepts to get the Maillard reaction on your steak. So for purposes of this, let me take a look at this. This is a sous vide steak right here. And you'll see that there's some char marks on it. On the other side, it looks like it was kind of pan fried or ovened. These steaks were all char marked before they went into the sous vide bath. You could do it before or after, or you could do it both. And simply for today's presentation with all the variables, I seared the steak before the sous vide bath. There's different groups that say this is better or that's better, but for the purposes of a to-go environment, I felt that that was the cleanest methodology. Sear it, water bath cooked, comes out of the water bath into a to-go container, and that represented a 25-minute lag time.
There is one more question here. This definitely, I think it's, probably you can evidently help us with. They're asking whether you should salt the meat once it's cooked, before cooking it. When do you salt it? If you put the salt before, do you submit it to any of these methods, or if you put the salt at the end?
So for the sous vide method, the salt is applied and seasoning is applied right before searing, kind of like you would do for a charbroiler. So if you're going to sear before you put it into water bath, you salt, season it, and sear it. If you do it afterwards, it's really important. We all know this with raw steaks, that we need to dry them first. But with sous vide, it's super important because when it comes out of the bag, there is some purge. And you've got to get that dry so that you could get the Maillard reaction from the charbroiler or the char grill for that steak. And definitely, after you dry it, you're seasoning it and then putting it on the charbroiler or char grill.
Well, I believe those are, there's one more question, sorry. Yeah, will the sous vide method help if it's an older, animal product? That is to say that if the meat that we're working with comes from an animal that is older of age, do you think that the sous vide method would help out in a better way than the other methods?
Sure. Sous vide is used for that as well. And you could use a higher temperature. You could get up to 190 degrees. You could go over 190 degrees, actually. But the water bath and the time to get your doneness. So if you're taking a look at a pork butt or something like that, you're cooking it at a higher temperature and for a longer period of time. My brisket, I cook sous vide for over 24 hours. Then I smoke it at the end, and I have a beautiful smoke flavor to it and a tender brisket. So I hope that answers your question.
I'm asking another question in terms of, would you recommend that the sides go in a different container, leaving the protein on its own and then sending sides on other containers? Do you think that would be help?
Thank you, Herman. Yes, sides can be placed in a separate container. The benefit to that, again, in thinking about that, so I've just got a small container right here that you could use for your sides. But yes, it is important in that thermalization method, because if the sides are too hot for the steak will continue to cook. And I've even gotten steaks in a to-go container that have about 2 inches of liquid. And what happens to the steak when it sits in that for 27 minutes? So I do recommend sides being packed separately. I recommend that they be reheated separately. And I recommend that if you get a chance to serve your customer just a little bit of au jus, serve them that and give them direction to heat that up rather than your steak, especially when you use a microwave, because a microwave is not friendly to a steak or to pork or even a lamb.
Tim, thank you very much again for all this wonderful information you shared with us today. Thank you on behalf of the US Meat Expert Federation and all the people involved in this project. Thank you everybody for attending, giving us your time and dedicating time for this. We know it's a difficult situation right now. We know the environment is changing, things are changing, but that's what we're here for, to be with you in this change and to help you out with useful suggestions and recommendations. And well, obviously we go to the experts such as Tim. Thank you, Tim, very much. And thank you, everybody.